Captain Darius Vex's pulse raced as his ship, the Horizon Breaker, tore through the atmosphere of an unfamiliar world. Sparks flew across the cockpit, and alarms screamed in warning, but there was nothing he could do. The enemy Dominion fleet had ambushed him, overwhelming his defenses and sending his ship crashing into the dense, mist-covered jungle below. He fought to keep his hands steady on the controls, but the craft bucked and shuddered violently as it plummeted toward the ground. His mind raced, running through options, but there were none. A desperate maneuver to avoid the worst of the crash only ended with the Horizon Breaker slamming nose first into the trees, and everything went black. When Darius finally came to, he was choking on smoke and the acrid scent of burning metal. His body ached from the impact, but somehow he was alive. His head throbbed, and his vision blurred as he struggled to focus. He could barely make out the wreckage of his ship surrounding him, a twisted mess of twisted steel and broken glass. The control panel was a pile of sparks and molten wires, but the emergency systems were still functional. He quickly activated his distress beacon, hoping it might reach someone. Anyone who could come to his rescue. He fumbled with the ship's damaged communication panel, trying to get a message out. But the ship was dead in the water, and his beacon was weak. Only static filled the air as his frustration grew. The silence of the alien world outside seemed deafening. Darius sat up, his breath ragged, and tried to assess his surroundings. He was stranded on a strange, hostile planet, and there was no sign of friendly life. Suddenly, the air shifted. A low, rumbling sound echoed from the jungle around him. Darius tensed, every muscle in his body primed for action. He reached for his sidearm, but before he could even draw it, the trees parted with an eerie grace. He could see shadows moving among the towering bioluminescent plants. A strange sense of unease crawled up his spine. He wasn't alone. A group of creatures emerged from the jungle, tall, humanoid figures with angular features and sleek, metallic skin. Their eyes glowed faintly with a fierce violet hue, and their posture was rigid, as though they were built for war. Darius narrowed his eyes, instinctively assessing the situation. They were no ordinary beings. The designs of their armor and their movements suggested a race with both advanced technology and a brutal military history. He had never encountered anything quite like them. The beings stepped closer, and Darius's heart skipped a beat. Their leader, a striking woman with sharp features and long, dark hair that shimmered in the faint light, locked her gaze onto him. She said something in a language Darius didn't understand, her voice calm but commanding. The others flanked her in a perfect formation, their eyes scanning him like a pack of predators circling their prey. "Who are you?" Darius asked, his voice rough but firm. The woman's lips curved into a slight, unreadable smile. The woman stepped forward, the silence between them heavy with tension. Her gaze never wavered from Darius, as if she were sizing him up. Her eyes were a piercing violet, unlike anything he had ever seen. She was taller than most humans, with a lithe yet muscular build, her skin a metallic sheen, reflecting the dim light of the jungle. The other figures behind her stood silently, awaiting her orders. Darius couldn't help but feel a shiver run down his spine as the woman slowly crouched beside him. She studied him with a mixture of curiosity and wariness, her expression unreadable. In her presence, even the dense jungle seemed to hold its breath, waiting for something to happen. The moment was heavy, the air charged with unspoken meaning. Darius sat still, his eyes locked on the strange woman before him, trying to gauge her next move. He was on a foreign world, his ship wrecked, and his only company a group of intimidating aliens who seemed as though they had stepped out of a nightmare. They towered over him, their metallic skin catching the light in eerie reflections, and their eyes glowed with a strange, cold intensity. His pulse quickened, but he forced himself to stay calm. He had been in dangerous situations before, but this was unlike anything he'd ever encountered. The woman, tall with sharp features and dark, shimmering hair, finally spoke again, her voice clear and steady. though it held a sense of authority. She wasn't asking. She was commanding. And though Darius couldn't understand her words, the tone was unmistakable. She was the leader. Her presence radiated power, and her every movement was purposeful, precise, as if she had done this 1,000 times. After a tense moment, she gestured to the others, and 2 of them moved forward. One was a hulking figure, standing nearly 7 feet tall, with broad shoulders and a face that looked like it was carved from stone. His eyes were the same violet hue, glowing faintly in the low light. The other was thinner, but just as imposing, their sharp features reflecting an icy, calculating gaze. Together, they grabbed Darius by the arms, lifting him to his feet with no regard for his protests. He gritted his teeth, trying to push against their grip, but their strength was overwhelming. They didn't speak, just moved in perfect sync, as if they had practiced this many times before. Darius struggled for a moment but quickly realized it was pointless. His training told him to keep calm, gather information, and wait for the right moment. He needed to understand who these beings were and what they wanted before he made any rash decisions. His focus shifted back to the woman, the leader. She had been watching him closely, her expression unreadable. They took him to a nearby structure, a massive crystalline building that seemed to pulse with its own energy. The walls glowed with faint blue light, and the air was thick with the scent of unfamiliar plants. The interior was just as strange, filled with complex technology he couldn't begin to comprehend. As they entered, the rest of the group followed, their eyes never leaving him. The woman gave a quick, sharp command in her language, and the hulking warrior who had been holding him released his grip, pushing him forward. Darius stumbled but caught himself, feeling the weight of their gaze on him. He stood tall, refusing to show weakness, but his mind raced. What were they? Why hadn't they just killed him? As far as he knew, the Dominion had no allies in this part of the galaxy, but these beings clearly weren't human. The woman motioned for him to sit on a stone platform that resembled a throne, though it seemed oddly out of place in this alien world. Darius hesitated for only a moment before complying. As he sat, she moved to stand before him, her eyes never leaving his. She spoke again, her words laced with an authority that made his spine stiffen. Her tone was different now. There was curiosity in it, something that hinted at both danger and possibility. Darius could only stare back, unsure of what to say or do. He knew that his survival here depended on one thing: understanding them. And to do that, he needed to stay alive long enough to gain their trust, or at the very least, avoid provoking them. Then, to his surprise, the woman lowered herself slightly, her eyes still locked on his. In a language he didn't understand, she spoke the words that would change everything. "You are my responsibility now." Her words were soft but filled with an unexpected weight. Darius caught his breath, his mind struggling to make sense of what was happening. He had just been captured by an alien race, and yet this mysterious woman, who he still knew nothing about, had claimed him as her responsibility. There was no malice in her voice, only an almost unreadable intent. For the first time since the crash, Darius felt the faintest flicker of hope. The days after Darius's capture were long and uncomfortable. He was held in a small stone chamber within the crystal building, a place that seemed more like a prison than a sanctuary. His hands were bound, though the restraints were not tight enough to break his spirit. Every so often, the towering Nixari warriors, silent and imposing, would come to check on him, their eyes glowing with an eerie violet hue. Despite their presence, Darius couldn't shake the feeling that the woman who had claimed him as her responsibility, Vale Reus, was keeping a careful watch over him. She was different from the others. While her warriors moved with the cold precision of soldiers, Vale Reus carried an air of quiet authority. She had a presence that demanded respect without words. Every time she entered the room, her gaze would find him, her violet eyes unreadable, and for a moment, Darius felt the weight of that gaze more than he did the chains around his wrists. On the third day, Vale Reus appeared at the door again, her sharp features illuminated by the soft light from the crystals that lined the walls. She wasn't accompanied by any of her warriors, and for the first time, she was not dressed in her heavy armor. Instead, she wore simple, flowing garments of dark, metallic fabric that clung to her lithe form, emphasizing her graceful, yet powerful, movements. She looked less like a warrior now and more like a figure of royalty, with an aura that was both intimidating and captivating. Darius didn't know what to expect, but he didn't flinch as she approached. He had learned over the past few days that any sign of fear would only make his situation worse. He stood as she entered, keeping his posture strong. To his surprise, Valerie spoke to him in a language that, while still foreign, seemed a little more familiar than before. She had been patient with him, teaching him a few words over the past few days. He had learned to understand some of their basic language, though he was still far from fluent. "You are alive," she said, her voice surprisingly soft for someone so fierce. "That is something I did not expect." Darius glanced at her, trying to read her expression. "Why didn't you expect me to survive?" Her lips curled into a slight smile, though there was no humor in it. "You are a human. We are not accustomed to your kind surviving so stubbornly." Darius's brow furrowed at the remark, but he didn't say anything. Instead, he met her gaze, trying to show that he was not intimidated by her. Valerie stepped closer, her eyes scanning him with a careful intensity. She tilted her head, almost as though considering something. "You have proven yourself useful," she said slowly, her voice soft, but carrying an edge of something deeper, something like respect. "You were able to fight, to survive. The others thought you weak. I saw it differently." The words surprised him. He had expected to be nothing more than a prisoner in their eyes, a captive to be experimented on or discarded. But here she was, acknowledging his strength. It was strange, but there was something about the way she looked at him that made Darius believe she wasn't just being polite. "Thank you," he said simply, though it didn't fully capture what he felt. He was grateful, sure, but there was still so much he didn't understand. She nodded, her gaze never leaving his. For a moment, they just stood there in silence, a kind of understanding passing between them. Valerie had saved him from a quick execution, and now she was giving him a chance. It was clear now that her reasons went beyond mere practicality. There was something deeper, something that even Darius couldn't quite grasp yet. "I will teach you," she said after a long pause, "not just to speak our language, but to understand us. To fight like an Ixari." The promise made Darius's heart skip a beat. She was offering him something. A chance, a purpose. It was more than he had ever expected from his enemies. And yet, the way she said it, as if it were a given, made him believe it was something he couldn't refuse. And in that moment, Darius realized that surviving this world might be harder than he thought. But with Valerie's mercy, it was possible. Darius had no choice but to trust Valerie's. Every day, she visited him, bringing with her a mixture of both harsh lessons and unexpected kindness. The warriors who guarded him seemed to relax around her, perhaps because of her authority, or maybe because of the strange connection she seemed to have with him. They didn't seem to understand it, but Darius was starting to see it. Something in Valerie's eyes told him she saw potential in him, a belief that he could be more than just a human captive. At first, the lessons were simple: basic language, simple gestures, and survival skills. Valerie was patient but firm, showing him how to navigate the dense jungles outside the city, where danger lurked behind every shadow. The jungle was a place of constant threat, with creatures that stalked from the trees and plants that seemed to have minds of their own. But Valerie was never afraid. She moved through the jungle with a grace that took Darius's breath away. She knew its rhythms, its dangers, its patterns. She was one with the wild, and as he learned from her, he felt the first stirring of something deep inside, a connection to this strange world he had been thrown into. Every day, she pushed him harder, forcing him to test his limits, but Darius never complained. He couldn't afford to. If he had any chance of escaping this alien world, of returning to his own, he needed to learn to survive here first. And Vale Reese had become his teacher. One evening, as they sat by a crackling fire after another long day of training, Darius found himself looking at her in a way he hadn't before. Her cold, imposing demeanor had softened in moments like these, when the two of them were alone, away from the ever-watchful eyes of the other Nixari. She seemed less like the warrior who had captured him and more like a person who had a depth beyond her military title. Vale Reese had been quiet for most of the evening, her violet eyes staring into the fire. Darius had been contemplating his next move, trying to find a way to get back to his ship, but each plan he came up with seemed impossible. This world was dangerous, and the Nixari weren't exactly friendly allies to humans. Yet despite all that, he couldn't help but wonder if his survival here had more to do with his relationship with Vale Reese than any chance of escape. "You've changed," she said suddenly, her voice soft, but piercing the quiet night. Darius blinked in surprise. "Change?" he echoed. "How?" Vale Reese turned her gaze to him, her sharp features illuminated by the firelight. "You no longer fight every lesson. Before, you resisted me at every turn. Now, you listen. You learn." Darius felt a flush of warmth creep up his neck, but he wasn't sure if it was from the fire or from her words. She had noticed. She had noticed how he had stopped resisting, how he had started trusting her. It wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about something more personal. "I don't have a choice," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "You saved my life. I owe you more than just my survival." For a moment, Vale Reese said nothing. She looked at him with a mixture of surprise and something else, something he couldn't quite place. Then she spoke again, this time her tone almost softer than before. "You owe me nothing, human. You are a warrior now. Your strength is your own." Darius wasn't sure if he believed her. He wasn't used to hearing such words. Back home, he had always fought for the survival of his crew, for the safety of humanity. But now, on this alien world, there was no crew to save, no mission to accomplish. It was just him and her, and something else, something unspoken, hung between them. For the first time since his crash, Darius felt as if he might belong here. He wasn't just a prisoner anymore. He was a student, and maybe, just maybe, he was becoming something more, something worthy of Vale Reese's faith in him. Days turned into weeks, and Darius grew stronger with each passing moment. Vale Reese's teachings had become more intense, and now she focused not just on survival skills, but on tactics, how to fight like the Nixari. He was learning the way of their people, their methods of combat, and their honor. At first, he had struggled. His human body wasn't built for the kind of combat the Nixari were used to, but Vale Reese was relentless, pushing him to the edge and beyond. The training was grueling. Vale Reese would take him out into the dense jungle and set up challenges, tests of endurance, strength, and cunning. It wasn't enough to simply survive the creatures lurking in the shadows. He had to learn how to think like a predator, how to anticipate his enemies' moves before they made them. One day, she left him alone in the jungle with nothing but a dagger and a few basic supplies, telling him he had 3 hours to return to the city without being caught. It was a test, and failure would mean more than just losing the challenge. It would mean disappointing her, and that was the last thing he wanted. Darius fought through the dense undergrowth, his heart pounding in his chest. Every sound, every rustle in the bushes, made him jump, his instincts screaming at him to be on guard. He could feel the sweat on his brow, and his muscles were sore from the days of constant training. But he pushed through. He had come too far to fail now. After what felt like an eternity, he finally reached the outskirts of the jungle, barely making it back to the city before the time ran out. Vale Reese was waiting for him, standing tall with her arms crossed. She didn't speak immediately, but her gaze never left him, and Darius couldn't help but feel the weight of her judgment. "Well?" she asked, her voice low. Darius caught his breath, his chest heaving. I made it. For a moment, there was silence, and Darius couldn't tell if she was pleased or disappointed. Then she finally spoke, her tone surprisingly soft. You are learning, but you still hesitate. In combat, hesitation will kill you. Darius nodded, understanding the weight of her words. The Niksari were fierce and unforgiving, and he needed to become like them if he wanted to survive here. He wasn't just training to defend himself anymore. He was training to fight alongside them. And that meant learning not to hesitate, not to doubt himself, even when the stakes were high. As the days passed, their bond grew. Vale Reese had become more than just his mentor. She was his ally, his teacher, and in a way, the closest thing he had to a friend. He had never expected to form such a connection with someone from another species, let alone someone as formidable as Vale Reese. Yet there was an undeniable trust between them, a trust that grew with each lesson, and each shared silence in the jungle. He had seen the vulnerability in her too, in rare moments when the walls around her would crack just enough for him to catch a glimpse of the woman beneath the warrior. One evening, as the sun set behind the distant mountains, Vale Reese took him to a high cliff overlooking the city. The sky was painted in shades of red and gold, and the wind carried a fresh scent of the wild jungle below. They stood there in silence, the weight of the world seeming to fall away. Darius couldn't help but speak, breaking the silence. Why are you doing this? Why are you teaching me? Vale Reese turned to him, her violet eyes reflecting the fading light of the day. Because I see something in you, human, something you don't even see in yourself. You have strength, and it is not your survival that matters now, but your will to fight. That is the true test. Darius looked at her, his heart heavy with words unsaid. He didn't know if he could ever truly become one of them, if he could truly belong here. But he understood now. Vale Reese didn't just want him to survive. She wanted him to thrive, and that would be his greatest challenge. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Darius felt something stir within him. Maybe, just maybe, he wasn't so far from home after all. The days in the jungle grew more dangerous as the lessons became more intense. Darius's body had toughened, his reflexes sharper, but the pressure to prove himself to Vale Reese never let up. Every day felt like a test, and each moment he spent with her added weight to the growing bond between them. Yet, as much as he had learned, he knew there was still one thing he had yet to prove: his loyalty. Vale Reese was not just teaching him how to survive or how to fight. She was preparing him for something far more important. He hadn't understood it fully at first, but now, the pieces were starting to come together. This world, the Niksari people, they had a strict code. Their honor and loyalty were everything. To stand by Vale Reese's side, to fight for her, meant more than just trust. It meant a bond that went deeper than anything he had ever known. One morning, after a long night of rain, Vale Reese led Darius through the muddy trails of the jungle. The air was thick with moisture, and the ground beneath their feet was slippery and uneven. They had not spoken much, but Darius could sense that something was different today. There was an edge to her movements, a tension that he had never felt before. They came to a clearing, the trees parting to reveal a circle of Niksari warriors. Among them, Darius saw the familiar hulking figure of Turkan, one of Vale Reese's most trusted soldiers. But something was off. Turkan's posture was stiff, and his eyes darted between Darius and the others in the circle. He looked as if he were waiting for something. Vale Reese stepped forward, and the warriors fell silent. Darius's heart began to race as he realized this was not just another training exercise. This was something different, something important. Darius, Vale Reese's voice cut through the silence. Today, you will be tested. The bond between us must be proven, not by words, but by actions. Darius felt his throat tighten. What do you mean? Vale Reese glanced at Turkan, who stepped forward, his massive form casting a shadow over Darius. Turkan has questioned your loyalty. He believes you are unworthy of standing with the Nixari. Darius felt a wave of confusion wash over him. Torkin had always been silent, distant, but he had never shown anything that hinted at distrust. I've been learning from you. I've fought beside you. Why? Valoris raised a hand to silence him. Words mean nothing. You must prove your loyalty. Today, Torkin will test you. If you survive this test, you will have earned your place among us. If you fail, you will be cast out. The challenge hit Darius like a punch to the gut. This wasn't just a test of survival or combat skills. It was a test of something far more personal. His loyalty to Valoris, to the Nixari people, was now being questioned in front of the entire circle of warriors. Torkin stepped forward, his eyes cold and calculating. Prepare yourself, human. This will be a test you will never forget. Valoris did not speak again. She simply watched as Darius stood tall, his pulse quickening, his mind racing. He had no choice now but to fight. He knew Torkin's strength. He had seen the warrior in action, and Darius was no fool. He understood what was at stake. If he hesitated even for a second, it could cost him everything. Torkin lunged at him without warning, his fist swinging in a brutal arc. Darius barely managed to dodge, feeling the air shift as the massive fist passed mere inches from his face. His body moved on instinct, his training kicking in. Every movement he made was focused, controlled, but there was no room for error. Torkin was relentless, his attacks coming faster and faster, each one designed to break Darius's defenses. With a sharp breath, Darius blocked a punch and countered, using the techniques Valoris had taught him. He aimed for Torkin's midsection, landing a blow that made the giant stagger. The warriors around them let out a collective breath, watching with wide eyes. Valoris's gaze never left Darius as the battle raged on. There was no turning back now. Every strike, every move, he had to prove that he belonged, that he could stand alongside her, not as a prisoner, not as a human, but as a warrior of the Nixari. As Torkin recovered, his expression darkened, and he lunged again. But this time, Darius was ready. With a swift move, he sidestepped, knocking Torkin to the ground with a well-placed kick. The crowd of warriors erupted in a roar of surprise, and for the first time, Darius saw a flicker of approval in Valoris's eyes. Darius had passed the test, not just of skill, but of loyalty. After the intense trial, Darius felt a surge of both pride and exhaustion. He had proven his worth in the eyes of the Nixari warriors, but the victory came with its own weight. As Torkin lay on the ground, stunned by the force of Darius's kick, the crowd of warriors slowly began to disperse, murmuring among themselves. Valoris's gaze never wavered from him, and though there was no obvious emotion on her face, Darius could sense her approval. Still, the silence between them was heavy. Torkin struggled to rise, his face red with anger, but his pride stopped him from challenging Darius further. He gave the human a hard stare, then turned away, muttering under his breath. Darius knew that despite his victory, Torkin's resentment wouldn't disappear so easily. It was only a matter of time before the warriors who had once doubted him would test him again. Valoris stepped forward, her movements as graceful as ever, though there was an air of quiet contemplation about her. "You have done well, Darius," she said, her voice soft but firm. "You have earned your place here, but understand this. You will never stop proving yourself. The Nixari are not like humans. Trust is earned, and loyalty must be shown at every turn." Darius nodded, still catching his breath. The adrenaline from the fight was slowly leaving his body, and the weight of what Valoris had said sank in. He had fought for his place, yes, but the battle for acceptance wasn't over. Not by a long shot. She motioned for him to follow her, leading him out of the clearing and back into the dense jungle. The sounds of the forest surrounded them, but the air felt different now. It was as if the trees themselves were watching him, and the ground beneath his feet felt heavier. As they walked in silence, Darius couldn't help but think about what lay ahead. He had proven himself in combat, but what else would the Nixori require of him? Finally, Valoris broke the silence again. You did not hesitate. That is good. But remember, hesitation can also save your life. You will learn when to strike and when to wait. There is no honor in needless violence. Darius thought about her words as they walked. It was clear that the Nixori warriors didn't simply fight for the thrill of battle. There was a purpose to everything they did, and each action had meaning. He hadn't understood it fully before, but now he was starting to see the world through their eyes. Every choice, every move, had consequences. When they reached the edge of the jungle, Valoris stopped and turned to face him. Her violet eyes locked onto his, and Darius could feel the intensity of her gaze. I did not save you just to make you a weapon, Darius, she said, her voice softer now, almost gentle. I saved you because I see something in you, something beyond just survival. You are more than what you have been trained to be. I want you to become more. The weight of her words settled heavily in Darius's chest. He had always fought to survive, to protect his people. But now, with Valoris's words, he felt as though he was being asked to do something more. He wasn't just surviving anymore. He was being shaped into something greater, something that could change not just his fate, but perhaps the fate of those around him. I will, Darius said, the words coming more easily than he expected. I will become what you believe I can be. Valoris studied him for a moment, as if weighing his sincerity. Then she nodded, her lips curling into a faint smile. Good. But remember, there is always a price for victory. The Nixori do not ask for favors without a cost. When the time comes, you will pay that price. Darius wasn't sure what she meant, but the seriousness in her tone made it clear that he would soon face a test unlike any he had encountered before. He had gained her trust, but that trust came with expectations that would not be easily met. And as much as he wanted to prove himself worthy of her faith, he couldn't shake the feeling that the path ahead would be more dangerous than anything he had faced so far. As they made their way back to the city, Darius's mind was filled with questions. What would this price be? And what was he truly becoming in the process? The answers were still elusive, but one thing was certain. His journey with Valoris had only just begun, and the stakes had never been higher. Darius's sense of unease only deepened as the days wore on. Though he had earned Valoris's trust and proved his loyalty in the eyes of the Nixori warriors, he could feel a storm brewing on the horizon. The city of Zyronok, the heart of the Nixori civilization, pulsed with a strange energy. Tension was in the air, and the warriors moved with an edge that suggested something was coming. Valoris had kept her distance from him for the past few days, only offering brief lessons and silent glances when their paths crossed. Darius had learned to read her unspoken words, but now he wasn't sure what to make of her cold demeanor. He couldn't shake the feeling that she was preparing for something that would force him to face the consequences of his victory over Torkin. The city was buzzing with rumors. There were whispers among the warriors about an impending mission, something that required the strength of the strongest fighters in the Nixori. Darius had heard snippets of conversations, but nothing concrete. Even Torkin had been unusually silent, his anger from the trial now replaced with a watchful, calculating gaze whenever he passed Darius. But what unsettled Darius the most was the way Valoris had been avoiding him. It was as if she was preparing him for something he didn't yet understand. One evening, after a long day of training, Darius made his way to the high cliffs where he and Valoris had shared their quiet moments. The sunset bathed the world in fiery orange and gold, casting long shadows across the vast expanse of the jungle below. As he stood there, staring into the horizon, he felt a presence behind him. He didn't need to turn to know who it was. Valoris, he said, his voice low. She stepped into his line of sight, her violet eyes flickering with something unreadable. Her usually calm and composed demeanor had changed. There was a weariness in her posture that Darius hadn't noticed before. Darius, she responded softly. her voice carrying the weight of something unspoken. "You've earned my trust, but there is a price to pay for it. The time has come." Darius swallowed hard, trying to calm the rush of thoughts flooding his mind. "What do you mean? What time?" Valoris crossed her arms, her gaze shifting toward the distant city, as though searching for something far beyond the horizon. "There is a war coming. The Nixari are preparing to strike, to take what we've been waiting for. A new alliance, a new path, but it will come with a cost. And I need you to be ready, Darius." Darius's heart skipped a beat. A war. He had known the Nixari were fierce, but he hadn't fully understood the scope of their ambitions. This wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about something much bigger. "What do you need me to do?" he asked, his voice steady despite the storm of emotions within him. Valoris turned to face him, her eyes locked onto his with an intensity that sent a shiver down his spine. "I need you to trust me completely. The Nixari are not known for their mercy, but we are fighting for something far greater than just territory or power. We are fighting for our future. You will have to make a choice, Darius. A choice that will define where you stand." Darius felt a chill run through him. He had come so far from the frightened human who had crashed on this alien planet. But now, standing on the precipice of something much bigger, he realized that his journey had only just begun. His loyalty to Valoris would be tested in ways he hadn't yet imagined, and the cost of his allegiance could change everything. "What kind of choice?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. Valoris took a step closer, her voice barely audible above the wind. "When the time comes, you will have to decide where your true loyalty lies. Not just to me, not just to the Nixari, but to something greater, something that could change the balance of the entire galaxy. Will you fight for the future of our people, or will you choose a different path?" Darius's heart raced as her words sank in. He had thought he was prepared for anything. But this was more than he had ever imagined. The stakes were higher than ever, and he realized that no matter what happened, the choice he would have to make would define not just his future, but the future of the galaxy itself. As the last rays of the sun dipped below the horizon, Darius stood on the edge of a new reality, uncertain of what lay ahead, but knowing one thing for sure. The storm was coming, and he would have to face it head-on. The days following Valoris's cryptic words weighed heavily on Darius. The tension in the air of Zhyranak had thickened, the streets filled with warriors preparing for something far greater than anything Darius had ever seen. The preparation for war was not just a physical battle, but a test of everything he had learned: his strength, his loyalty, his ability to make the hardest choices. Valoris had distanced herself even further, leading secretive meetings with her most trusted commanders, leaving Darius to train alone. His days were filled with endless drills, learning the strategies of the Nixari, becoming a weapon even more honed than before. Yet in the silence of his training, he couldn't escape the nagging questions in his mind. What was the true cost of this war? And what did Valoris mean when she spoke of choosing where his loyalty lay? The night before the battle, the entire city of Zhyranak was quiet. The streets were dark, save for the soft glow of torchlight flickering on the stone walls. Darius stood at the edge of the training grounds, looking up at the stars, the same stars that had watched over him when he first arrived here. He remembered how small and lost he had felt, just a man from Earth, stranded in a world where everything seemed impossible. Now he was part of something bigger. But what was that something? And what was his role in it? Suddenly, Valoris appeared beside him, her presence as commanding as ever. She was silent for a long moment, staring out over the city before speaking. "Tomorrow, the battle begins. But tomorrow is not just about war. Tomorrow will show us who we truly are." Darius turned to her, searching her face for some sign of what was to come. "What do you mean? What happens tomorrow?" Valoris met his gaze, her eyes filled with an emotion he hadn't seen before: uncertainty, maybe even doubt. "The war will test our strength, our unity. But there is a choice I've been keeping from you, Darius. It's not something I wanted to burden you with, but now you must know the truth." Darius felt a cold shiver run down his spine. He had learned to trust Vale Reese with his life, but now she was telling him there was more to the war than he had ever imagined. "What choice?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. Valerise took a deep breath, as if gathering the courage to speak the words that had been weighing on her heart. "The alliance we seek is not just for the Nixari. It's for the entire galaxy. There are those who stand in our way. People, forces, who want to stop us. I've known about them for a long time, but they've been waiting for the perfect moment. That moment is now." Darius's mind raced. "And you want me to fight them? But I thought our enemy was the other faction of Nixari warriors." Valerie shook her head. "No, the enemy is much more dangerous. These forces are not just against us. They want to destroy everything we stand for. They want to erase the future we are fighting for." Darius was silent for a moment, processing the weight of her words. The stakes were even higher than he had imagined. It wasn't just a war for territory or honor. It was a war for the very future of the galaxy. And in that moment, Darius realized that his loyalty was not just to Valerise or the Nixari. It was to something much bigger. "Then what do I have to do?" Darius asked, his voice firm with the certainty of his decision. Valerise looked at him with a mix of pride and sorrow. "Tomorrow, you will be faced with a choice. You will need to decide whether you will stand with us and fight for the future of all life in the galaxy, or if you will turn away. It will be the hardest choice you will ever make. But whatever path you choose, you must know, it will change everything." Darius's heart pounded in his chest. He had never been a man of easy choices, but now, standing on the brink of this war, he knew one thing for sure. The choice he made would define not only his future but the future of everyone he had come to care about. The battle was just beginning, and as he turned to face Vale Reese, he made the only decision that mattered. He would stand with her. He would stand with the future of the galaxy. And no matter the cost, he would fight.